Well, Kevin, you recently had a very interesting story about a new company called Mechanize.
Yes, this was a fun one to write. This was a startup in San Francisco that got started earlier this year. They raised a bunch of money from people you probably know. Patrick Collison was one of their investors. Jeff Dean, a big AI honcho at Google, was another one. They are a very buzzy startup. And what attracted me to writing about them was that they have said that their goal is to automate all labor. They want to take away everyone's jobs, yours, mine, everyone we know, and replace them with AI. And they think they can do this in the coming decades with a new type of reinforcement learning system.
Well, that is a promise we have heard from a number of Silicon Valley companies, but maybe none as directly as the Mechanize founders are pitching it. What exactly is their secret sauce?
Well, they are building what they call reinforcement learning training environments, basically, sort of simulated environments that these new AI agents can use to learn how to do various white collar jobs. And they believe that this approach can scale not just to software engineering, which is the first job that they're trying to automate, but to all other kinds of jobs eventually as well. And I thought this was an important conversation to have on the show because we've been talking about AI and jobs for the last couple of episodes now. I think this is a conversation that is beginning to grow more and more important and more urgent. And there's starting to be evidence of some job displacement from AI. And then along come these guys at Mechanize who say, well, this is actually only the tip of the iceberg. You have not seen anything yet. Our plan is to help these giant AI companies automate a bunch more jobs very quickly.
Well, that seems to raise a lot of important questions about how society would deal with the fallout of such a thing. So, why don't we bring in these founders and see what they have to say about it?
Yep, let's bring in Matthew Barnett and Ege Erdil from Mechanize. Matthew and Ege, welcome to Hard Fork.
Hi. Hi.
So I had a lot of fun writing this story about Mechanize, the company that you all founded along with your third co-founder, Tame Besaraglu, earlier this year. And one of the things that made me interested in what you were doing is that unlike a lot of AI companies I cover who sort of pretend not to be automating jobs, or they say, we're just making helpful co-pilots and assistants for workers. We're not going to replace their jobs. You all were actually coming out and saying, yes, we absolutely want to automate jobs, and not just a couple of them. We want to automate all jobs. So, tell me what inspired you three to leave Epoch AI, the research firm where you were before this, and start this company, and to be so open about the agenda of automating labor.
Yeah, I guess when we were at Epoch AI, which is a nonprofit research organization which had the mission of informing society about trends in artificial intelligence, we did a bunch of research into the economics of AI. And as part of that research, we looked into what would be the impact of AI that could substitute for human workers across the economy on the economic growth rate. And a very robust conclusion of that research was that it would speed up economic growth by enormous amounts, like unprecedented amounts, maybe by 10 times, maybe more compared to current rates. And that would unlock like such a vast abundance of not just like material goods, but also services that today can only be provided by humans, technological progress, like medical progress, that currently, no matter how much money you have, you can't really purchase. We think if AI automates everyone's job, because we can scale the AI workforce so much more than we can scale the human workforce, that leads to this vast abundance, enormous increase in the variety of goods, new medicine, new technologies, etc., and makes people's lives much better.
So, this is a story we've heard from other AI founders. They want to unlock a world of radical abundance. And I think a lot of our listeners hear that and they think, okay, here comes the Silicon Valley hype guys, and they're out there raising funds. And so they're gonna tell me this beautiful story so that they can raise billions of dollars and, they'll get rich. How do you respond to the idea that this is kind of just a bunch of hype that you're selling to kind of benefit your own project?
I I guess I would say that the difference between just hype that someone's speculating about and something that's real is you can test it empirically. You can look whether it's a implication of robust economic models. You can try to look at the history of automation. And I would just say that if you look at the empirical evidence, it's quite clear that automation has been good for most people. People have benefited from mechanization of agriculture, from refrigeration to all these sorts of technologies. So I would just say that anyone who thinks that it's just benefiting a small group of people should really study the history of automation. And I think that almost all the evidence would show that they're wrong.
Well, I have studied the history of automation. I wrote a whole book that touched on the history of automation. And one of the things that I want to just really impress upon you all is that, like, I do agree with the statement that automation and technology broadly generally improve people's lives in the long run. I don't think, for example, a lot of us would willingly switch places with our great great grandparents. They had hard, backbreaking lives of manual labor. Um, but people don't live in the long run. People live in the short run, and in every technological revolution that we've ever had, there have been people who struggle, who fall through the cracks, who aren't able to sort of seamlessly make the jump from one era to another. So, what do you say to those people who look at you and say, "Well, I get that this future of radical abundance may be, possible somewhere down the line, but for me, in the year 2025, what this looks like is my job getting automated away and me not having any way to pay my bills."
Well, I guess a few things. First of all, I think because AI, we expect AI to speed up economic growth, assuming it can substitute for everyone's job and not just like the job of like a few percent of workers or something like that. The impact of that is so big that I don't actually think the long run is that long. Like it might be like a few decades or something like that. So it might easily be within the lifespan of like most people who are currently alive, for example. That's one thing. But the other thing is I think the standard of we should only automate jobs, or we should only like embrace new technologies if there are no losers, if like nobody is made worse off by the adoption of a new technology, is extremely strict. I don't think that's a reasonable standard. If AI can actually substitute for human workers across the entire economy, it's just a substitute for a human worker. And in that case, humans would no longer be getting income from wages. But there are a lot of other sources of income. There are countries in the world today where actually citizens get their income from, say, natural resource endowment. Like there's just a certain amount of natural resources that country owns, and the government has maybe a sovereign wealth fund, maybe they have other ways in which they can distribute the income from that natural resource to the population. And that is something we see in our world today. So it's not actually that far-fetched. And that's the kind of thing I would expect to happen in a world where AIs are vastly more capable and human workers like cannot compete.
So you guys published a blog post recently where you wrote about, in part, the history of automation in software engineering.
Mhm.
And you note that automation has been coming to software engineers over a period of decades. And as that has happened, their jobs largely have not been eliminated. So what are you seeing right now that is making you say, okay, it really is different this time, and we're going to be able to go that last mile and actually fully automate everything and take away these software engineers' jobs?
I'm not sure we're actually saying that something is definitely different this time. In fact, two of my co-founders think that maybe full automation will take many decades. And so I don't think we're actually taking the strong view that there's something different in the next 5 or 10 years such that everyone will lose their jobs. I actually think that, especially in the next 5 years, we'll probably see a continuation of past trends, which is that AI automates some tasks within professions. It doesn't completely automate the entire profession in the sense of completely replacing most workers in those professions. So to take the example of software engineering, we think that these coding assistants will be used to help software engineers. We don't necessarily think that the coding assistants will be able to do all the jobs that a software engineer can do. So, for example, a software engineer often needs to coordinate across teams. They often need to plan projects, test the software to make sure that it's up to the design specifications. They need to do a lot of these different types of things which are very hard to automate, which aren't just under the label of coding. And so we think that if AIs can just do coding, but it can't do these other things, then in fact it will lead to a productivity increase in these professions and probably raise wages for software engineers, even though it's not taking over their entire job. Of course, in the long run, we just expect that it will be able to take over people's jobs, but this isn't because of some specific thing that we think is different now. We just have a projection of here's how long we think it will take for AI to replace everything. And we have disagreements about that, but it's not that we think that it's like a qualitatively different type of automation. We just have a guess at how long that type of thing will take.
Got it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what you guys actually do. You've just raised a bunch of money. You're presumably hard at work building something. I've read a little bit about it in Kevin's article, but tell people what it is that you're actually building.
Yeah, so what we're building is a reinforcement learning process where we will design essentially virtual work environments, you could say, for models to acquire the skills that human professionals have that enable them to do their jobs.
Like using a spreadsheet, maybe.
Yeah, like using a spreadsheet, using common software tools that people use in their work, like, I don't know, Slack for messaging, checking their email. If they're doing software engineering, then using tools like GitHub. So what we're doing is creating these work environments with scoring. So basically, we have a bunch of tasks in these environments, and we can score a model to see, did the model do this task well? How well did the model do this task? And then we give this to an AI company, and they are able to train their model in this environment. So they handle the parts where they train it, but we are the ones who supply them the environment in which they will be doing this training.
The way your co-founder Tame explained it to me, that I thought was a useful model for my understanding, was that you are basically creating what amounts to like very boring video games, in which like the goal of the video game is to be a software engineer or be a lawyer or
Yeah.
be an accountant, and you sort of set up this environment, and then the AI agent goes and plays it a bunch of times and
Yeah.
gets the signal for whether they failed or succeeded, and ideally gets better over time until it's good enough to actually do the full job. Is that more or less correct?
You can say that.
I think that's a good description. Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think the next target is after software engineering? What is the next easiest job to automate using this technique?
Huh. I guess, I mean, there are some things that are adjacent to software engineering, like data science, for example, might be a good target. And we have
Podcasting?
I think that would take it like a different kind of reward signal, maybe.
Okay, so you're sort of at work on these systems. I'm struck by the fact that there's this interesting tension where on one hand you're saying that you're going to automate all labor. On the other hand, you're saying, well, it might take 20 or 30 years. You've also like raised venture capital and they all want a return within like 7 years. So like, what are those conversations like? Like, what are you promising to give them, before the end of the decade?
I mean, even if you just automate a substantial fraction of labor, but not all labor, then that would still be extraordinary in terms of the amount of progress we would have made over a brief period of time. So I think if we could get as far, I mean, very ambitious of automating like 20% of current jobs within the next 5 years, that would be insanely valuable from just like a conventional perspective. Now, if you talk to people in Silicon Valley, at OpenAI, at all the AI labs, if you think in those terms, then they would scoff at just automating 20% of jobs in 5 years. They would think that's maybe very conservative. But I would just say in conventional terms, that'd be enormous. So I don't think we need to achieve the ambitious long-term goal of automating all jobs for this to be a successful venture within like just a brief period of time.
Got it.
I have a question for you guys. So when I was at your launch event and I stood up during the Q&A and I said, is any of this ethical? Matthew, you had a response to me that I thought was interesting. So I want to ask you for an abridged version of that case. Make the case that what you are doing, trying to automate jobs, is ethical.
Well, I think what I said was that it was a question of cost and benefits. I would say that there are costs to automating everything. It's true that people will lose their jobs. However, we need to compare this to the enormous upside potential from automating all jobs, which is this vast prosperity that would be created from automating labor. It'd be the fact that goods and services would be much easier to produce, which would mean that we just have a much higher standard of living across virtually all areas of life. I think that this would I think one thing in particular that people miss is that the secret to mass consumption is mass production. Like, in order to get people to consume a lot of goods and services, in order to get people to have a high quality of life, this needs to be backed up by a lot of production, a lot of goods and services actually being produced. So if you have some mechanism that's able to expand the base of goods and services that are being produced, then as long as there's some way for this to be shared among the broad population, not necessarily equally, but just as long as there's some way in which these goods and services can be distributed even slightly, then I think that that just leads to almost everyone becoming better off. And not just in terms of them having a higher material standard of living, but I think also their lives would still have meaning. They would find new ways for their life to have meaning other than work. I think, for example, one thing people didn't anticipate, perhaps in 1800, if you were to ask people, would all this automation be able to work out if people aren't going to be constantly working on a farm? They might not have been able to anticipate, for example, that in the next 200 years, we would have governments funded education in universities. And so people might not have realized that there's this alternative way of enjoying your time, which is going to school, which is going to college. This is a new way for people to spend their time, which I would argue is even more meaningful than these long hours toiling on a farm. And I would just think that that's the default that I would predict as a result of this empirical trend that we've already observed.
I know you guys are focused on the, capitalism part of this equation, but I'm curious what thoughts you do have on the role of government here. We're always struck on this show by the disconnect between, on one hand, we have entrepreneurs like yourselves saying, hey, in the next 18 to 24 months, the world is going to look very different. And on the other hand, the politicians mostly are just kind of like, okay, cool, go for it. Yeah. Are there things that you would like to see them doing, or you think they could do to get us ready for a world that was, very different within a few years?
I think it's a hard question. It is very hard for me to say what we could do today to make a world in which all jobs have been automated, or most jobs have been automated, much better. Right now, I only have a very vague sense of what that world is going to look like. When that world is actually here, we will have a much more detailed understanding of how things are going to work. And I think we have seen this.
I'm going to cut you off there. I understand that what you're saying is it's hard to know the future and it's hard to make policy based on something that is moving and changing so quickly. But do you think there are things that governments could or should be doing to cushion the fall for workers who may lose their jobs in the next, say, 5 to 10 years? Should they be sort of rolling out something like basic income or strengthening the social safety net? Do you have any ideas for how we could cope with mass job loss if what you are predicting comes true?
I don't really think we're predicting mass job loss in the next 5 or 10 years. At least I would assume that initially the impact of AI automation is actually going to be drive wages up, and it will lead to some occupations changing in character. So, for example, software engineers might still be employed, but their job might start looking different because some of the tasks have been automated. So I think the world in which there is mass job loss and mass unemployment, I think that world is further away. I would say definitely more than 10 years away. Maybe Matthew disagrees with me about this a little bit, but
well, I definitely don't expect mass job loss within the next few years or next 5 years. So I do think that it's kind of premature to start talking about government programs to cushion against that. I guess the thing that I would like to emphasize the most here is just that I think when people come up with plans for the future, especially if it's not an immediate plan of what to do in the next year, for example, I think that's just kind of overrated. I mean, if you asked people 10 years ago, what should we do to prepare for people losing their jobs from LLMs, then how many people would have been able to come up with a good recommendation of what to do by 2025? I just think that would have been overrated. So I think what's underrated, I think, is just being honest about our intentions, saying this is what we intend to do. This is our roadmap, perhaps. We don't actually know whether our roadmap will succeed, but this is at least what we're planning on doing at the moment. And we just think that at the time that these things are becoming more apparent, that they're becoming more salient, then people will be able to leverage the knowledge that they have, which they'll have detailed knowledge at the time that it's actually happening, far more detailed than they would have had 5 or 10 years in advance of the event actually occurring. And then they'll be able to use the tools and knowledge of the time to be able to craft appropriate policy. Committing ourselves to some sort of a plan or policy ahead of time without knowing these details, it just seems foolish to me.
Well, I mean, I think my counterpoint would be if you know that a pandemic is going to come at some point, you can manufacture and stockpile vaccines, right? Even if you don't know exactly when it's going to arrive. And so my hope would be sort of similarly here, if you know that there is going to be massive job loss to come, you could start saying, well, in such a world, what kind of solutions might exist? You
Sure,
have a
so
theory of the case.
I certainly agree that we can look at the character of the solutions that might exist. So I would say that the character of the solutions that would look reasonable are similar to the character of the solutions that we've already seen in the past. Governments, for example, have already become more generous in terms of redistributing income in the last 100 years or 200 years as automation has progressed. We have Social Security, for example, which didn't used to exist at all. We have Medicare, Medicaid. We have all these different programs for caring for people for the poor. We have the unemployment insurance. And I would say that a continuation of that character, those types of things for taking care of people, seems to make a lot of sense if you care about redistributing income. And so I would predict, and not just predict, but I would say that that's a reasonable thing to do in the future. But I don't necessarily have a particular plan of what that would look like. I'm not saying like, oh, a UBI would be best, but I just think that that type of thing makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Well, as I said in the article, I am glad that you all are being honest about your intentions. I think it is useful to have an honest and open conversation about the possibility of job loss through automation with AI. I do hope that you will find some sort of empathy for people who are really scared about what's coming. We hear from listeners every single week on the show who say that their jobs are changing in ways that they don't necessarily like because of AI, who are anxious that their bosses are trying to automate them out of a job. So I would just say, like, my free advice to you as you go out making your pitch about automating all jobs is just like there are people on the other side of that, and I think those people are concerned and worried, especially when they hear guys from San Francisco, talk about how they're excited to automate their jobs.
Yeah, I guess I would say it's difficult whenever you're doing something that you think has enormous benefits but has some costs. And in those cases, you can look at the people who are bearing costs or who fear that they might suffer the costs, and it's just like a very difficult thing to do. I mean, of course, I have empathy for those people, uh, wh- but I acknowledge that it feels kind of cold for me to say that I feel empathy for you, but I just think that these benefits that I'm listing are just much greater than the costs. But that's always, I think, what it sounds like when someone's performing some sort of utilitarian calculus. But compared to the vast majority of policies that people actually talk about in the public sphere, this is something that is much more positive sum than negative sum than you might have otherwise imagine.
All right. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there, but hopefully someday you can come back for another round of spirited debate after you've pushed the first.
Come back when you've automated podcasting and give us
All
the
right.
news. Thanks, guys.
Hey, that's the end of this clip. If you liked what you saw, head on over to our page and subscribe, and you can get the full podcast. We do a show like this almost every week on tech and the future. Head on over there now and subscribe.